The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked earth of Redemption's main street, the air shimmering in waves of heat that made the distant mesas tremble. For 3 years, Clara Bell had avoided this town, had avoided the sympathetic glances and whispered condolences that followed her like a shadow. Her grief was a private thing, a high-walled fortress she had built around her heart on the isolated homestead where she lived alone. But the supplies had run low, and the solitude had begun to feel less like a shield and more like a cage. She was just leaving the general store, a heavy sack of flour slung over her shoulder, when the first gunshot shattered the sleepy quiet of the day. Panic erupted like a flushed covey of quail. People screamed, diving for cover behind water troughs and overturned wagons. Clara dropped the flour sack, its white contents exploding across the dusty street like a ghost. Her eyes snapped toward the source of the chaos, the Redemption Bank and Trust. 3 masked men were backing out of the entrance, their pistols smoking. 2 of them herded the terrified bank teller ahead of them as a human shield, while the third, a tall man with an unnerving confidence in his stride, dragged a heavy iron lockbox by its handle. Clara's blood ran cold. It wasn't the violence that paralyzed her, not the fear that sent others scrambling for safety. It was the box. A plain black iron box, unremarkable to anyone else. But to her, it was everything. It was the safe deposit box her father had rented the year before. He, her mother, and her younger brother had vanished. The year the world had told her they were dead victims of a savage native raid. Inside that box, nestled amongst land deeds, and her father's pocket watch, was a small velvet pouch. And inside that pouch was her mother's silver locket. A simple heart-shaped piece of metal tarnished with age, containing faded portraits of her parents on their wedding day. It was the last tangible piece of her family she had left in the world. The leader of the robbers, the tall one, paused in the middle of the street. He pushed his mask up just enough to reveal a cruel, charismatic smile. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept across the terrified townspeople, cowering in the dust. A fine day for a withdrawal, he called out, his voice laced with a theatrical charm that made the threat feel all the more personal. He hefted the lockbox. The good people of Redemption have been most generous. A raw, helpless anger surged through Clara, overriding her fear. It was an emotion she hadn't felt in 3 years, an old familiar fire she thought her grief had extinguished. She saw Sheriff Miller, a good man, but hopelessly outmatched, inching out from behind the sheriff's office, his own pistol drawn, but held low. "Just let the man go, Thorne." The sheriff shouted, his voice tight with desperation. "Take the money and ride out." The name Thorne lodged in Clara's mind. The leader, Silas Thorne, merely chuckled. He gave a sharp nod to his men, who shoved the bank teller to the ground and mounted their horses in a fluid motion. Silas Thorne, however, took his time. He casually secured the lockbox to his saddle horn, his movements deliberate, mocking the lawman's impotence. His cold eyes scanned the street one last time, and for a chilling second they locked with Clara's. He couldn't have known who she was or what that box meant to her. But in his gaze she saw a flicker of something beyond simple greed. A deep, bottomless contempt for this town, for these people, for this very land. Then, with a final mocking tip of his hat to the sheriff, he spurred his horse. The gang thundered out of town, and the rhythmic thud of hooves kicking up clouds of ochre dust, leaving behind a shattered silence, a cloud of flour, and Clara Bell, a woman who had just been robbed of the only thing she had left to lose. The fortress she had built around her heart had been breached not by sorrow, but by rage. Her self-imposed exile was over. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a hunter, and she would get her locket back. The aftermath was a flurry of frantic activity and simmering resentment. Sheriff Miller, his face grim, tried to restore order, while townsfolk gathered in heated clusters, their fear quickly curdling into blame. "It's the tribes," a grizzled prospector spat, gesturing vaguely toward the distant plateaus. "They've been getting bolder. Stealing livestock poisoning wells. This is their doing, mark my words." "Silas Thorne ain't no native," the blacksmith countered, wiping soot from his brow. "He's a white man. A devil, maybe, but a white man all the same." The argument was an old one, a wound that never fully healed in this part of the territory. Every misfortune, from a dry well to a failed crop, was laid at the feet of the tribe, whose ancestral lands the town of Redemption was slowly encroaching upon. The tension was a dry powder keg, and Silas Thorne had just struck a match. Clara ignored them all. She walked back to her wagon, her movements stiff automatic. Her mind was already miles away, replaying the escape, analyzing the tracks the horses would have left. She had spent 3 years learning the language of the desert, how to read the stories written in disturbed sand and broken twigs. Her father had taught her back when the world was whole. He'd taught her to see things others missed. Now she would use those lessons to hunt the man who had stolen her past. She bought a canteen jerky and a box of cartridges, her face an unreadable mask. The store owner, a kindly man who had known her family, tried to offer his condolences about the robbery. "Terrible business, Clara. Just terrible. Sheriff Miller will get him." Clara looked at him, her eyes as hard and empty as the desert sky at noon. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "I will." By the time the sun began to bleed across the western horizon, Clara was miles out of town. The trail was easy to follow at first, 4 horses shod, moving fast and heavy. But as she rode, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Something was wrong. About 10 miles out, the tracks diverged. 3 horses continued north toward the lawless territories. The 4th, however, had broken off, heading east into the jagged, broken lands that served as a buffer between the settlers and the tribe. This 4th set of tracks told a different story. The gait was uneven, stumbling. There were deep scuffs in the dirt where a rider had struggled to stay in the saddle. And then she saw it. A dark, rust-colored stain on a pale rock. Blood. A lot of it. The main group hadn't just split up. They had left one of their own behind, wounded and bleeding. Or she considered this rider wasn't one of them at all. Her instincts screamed at her to follow the main group, the ones who had her locket. But a deeper curiosity, a tracker's intuition, pulled her east. Why would they leave a man behind, and why was he heading toward tribal lands? Against all logic, she turned her mare, following the path of the wounded rider. The trail led her deeper into a labyrinth of canyons and ravines, the air growing cooler as the shadows lengthened. She found him at the base of a sheer cliff face, sprawled beside a cluster of monolithic red rocks. He was not a bank robber. He was a native warrior, his face painted with markings she didn't recognize. He was unconscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. An ugly gash across his ribs had soaked his leather tunic, and a fresh bullet wound in his thigh was still seeping blood. His wrists were raw with rope burns. He hadn't been a part of the robbery. He had been their prisoner. As she dismounted, rifle in hand, his eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a startling urgency that seemed to cut through his pain. He looked past the rifle directly at her face, and his lips moved, forming a single, impossible word. "Belle," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Clara froze, her finger tightening on the trigger. How could he know her name? He struggled to push himself up, his eyes never leaving hers. They took it. He gasped, a hand moving weakly toward his own empty belt. The proof. Thorne has it. What proof? Clara demanded, taking a cautious step closer. What are you talking about? The warrior's gaze was unwavering. The man who robbed your bank, who stole from you. He's the same man responsible for what happened to your family. He coughed, a spray of blood speckling his lips. Your father. He knew. He tried to stop him. The world tilted on its axis. The heat, the robbery, the tracks, it all faded into a roaring in her ears. Her father. He spoke of her father in the present tense. It couldn't be. It was a trick, a lie. But as she looked into the dying warrior's eyes, she saw no deception, only a desperate shared truth. The man who had stolen her mother's locket was a ghost from a past she thought she had buried. And this stranger bleeding out in the desert held the key. Clara lowered the rifle, her mind a whirlwind of shock and dawning terrifying hope. She knelt beside him, the cold logic of her 3-year vigil dissolving in the face of this impossible revelation. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Chaitin," he said, his breathing shallow. "And I made a promise to your father." Trust was a currency Clara no longer possessed. For 3 years, the only thing she had trusted was the silence of the desert and the weight of the rifle in her hands. Now a wounded stranger lay before her, speaking her father's name, weaving a story that threatened to unravel the grim certainty she had mistaken for peace. "My father is dead." She stated the words, tasting like ash. It was a fact she had hammered into her own soul until it was as solid as the rock beneath her knees. "I buried what was left of him. You buried what Silas Thorne wanted you to find." Chaitin rasped, his eyes sharp with an intensity that defied his wounds. A burned wagon, bodies beyond recognition. It was a performance staged to end any questions. He winced, pressing a hand to the gush on his ribs. "Your father survived. Wounded, but he survived. He's been in hiding ever since gathering evidence against Thorne." Clara's mind reeled back to that day. The acrid smell of charred wood, the horrifying discovery. She had found her mother's wedding ring in the ashes, her brother's small leather boots miraculously untouched by the flames. She had clung to those objects as proof, as the final terrible punctuation to her family's story. Had it all been a lie? Evidence of what she demanded, her voice raw. Everyone said it was a tribal raid. "Because that is the lie Thorne has been carefully building." Chaitin explained, each word a visible effort. "He orchestrates attacks on settler families, on my people's hunting parties. He leaves false clues, pays false witnesses. He is pushing both our peoples toward a war." A cold dread seeped into Clara's bones, more chilling than the desert night. "Why for land?" "For what's under it," he corrected. "Silver. Enough to make a man a king. The treaty lands between your settlements and my people's territory are rich with it. A war would void the treaty. With both sides weakened and broken, his company could claim it all." His hand moved weakly to a small, empty leather sheath on his belt. "Your father compiled the proof, names, dates, bank ledgers showing payments to fake raiders. He gave it to me to present to a peace council. But Thorne knew. He ambushed me before I could get there." The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. The robbery and redemption wasn't just about money. The lockbox, her lockbox. Thorne wasn't just stealing from the bank, Clara thought aloud, her eyes widening. He was looking for something. Did he think the proof was in that box? "He's looking for anything connected to your father," Chaitin said, tying up loose ends. "He can't afford for anyone from the past to surface." The desert wind picked up, whispering through the canyons. It carried the scent of distant rain. Clara looked at the darkening sky, then back at Chaitin. His skin was pale, clammy. He was losing too much blood. "Why should I believe any of this?" she asked, the question a last bastion of her old guarded life. "This could all be a trick to save your own skin." Without a word, Chaitin reached slowly into a small pouch concealed within his tunic. His fingers fumbled, but eventually he withdrew a small cloth-wrapped object. He unfolded the fabric with trembling hands. Lying in his palm was a silver pocket watch, its casing intricately engraved with the initials T.B. Thomas Bell. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She would know it anywhere. The small dent on the rim from when her brother had dropped it. The fine scratch near the hinge. It had been missing from the wagon. He gave me this, Chayton said softly. He told me if anything happened to him, I should find his daughter. The one with his eyes who chose to stay in the desert because she hadn't given up hope. Tears blurred her vision. She took the watch, its familiar weight, a solid grounding presence in her hand. On the back was the family inscription, Tempus sanat omnia. Time heals all wounds. For 3 years it had been a bitter mockery. Now it felt like a prophecy. There's a meeting, Chayton continued, his voice growing fainter. In 2 days. At the Canyon of Whispering Winds. Leaders from both sides will be there. If Thorn's version of the truth is the only one they hear. He closed his eyes, his strength failing. Your father's sacrifice. It will all be for nothing. Thunder rumbled closer now. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the hot rock, each one sizzling like a dying ember. Clara looked from the watch in her hand to the warrior who held the key to her past and the fate of 2 nations. The question was no longer whether she believed him. It was what she was going to do about it. Her mission to retrieve a locket had just become a quest to reclaim a life she thought was lost forever, and to stop a war before it began. Her decision was made in the instant the storm broke. The rain came down in a sudden violent sheet, turning the dust to mud and plastering her hair to her face. She couldn't leave him here to die. He was her only link to her father, to the truth. There's a cave system about a half a mile from here. She said, her voice sharp and decisive over the drumming rain. She carefully tucked the pocket watch into her shirt. It will be dry. Can you walk? Chayton gritted his teeth, attempting to push himself up. He managed to get to one knee before his wounded leg gave out, and he collapsed back against the rock with a choked cry of pain. I can try. Trying isn't good enough. You'll bleed out before we go 50 yards. She moved closer, examining his wounds with a practiced eye. Her mother had been a healer, and she had passed on her knowledge of herbs and field medicine to Clara. The gash on his ribs was deep, still oozing. The bullet in his thigh needed to come out, and soon. Then leave me. Chayton said, his voice quiet but firm. Take the watch. Go to the canyon. Find a man named Samuel Crawford. He leads the settler delegation. My uncle Running Bear speaks for our council. Give them the watch. Tell them what your father discovered. Tell them what Thorn has done. Clara shook her head, a stubborn resolve hardening her features. I'm not leaving you. We're in this together now. He looked at her, and in his pain-filled eyes she saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of surprise, as if a settler's compassion was the last thing he expected. Why he asked the single word cutting through the storm's roar. The question hung in the air between them. Why was she risking everything for a man she'd just met, a warrior from a people she'd been taught to fear? The answer came to her simple and undeniable. Because for 3 years, I've been talking to ghosts, as she said, her own honesty startling her. If you're telling the truth, you're the first real thing to come out of that past. And if you're lying, she met his gaze. Then I'll deal with that later. But I won't have your death on my conscience. She scanned their surroundings. The caves were too far, but her homestead nestled into the side of a hill was closer. It was a risk. Bringing him there would mean leading the world she'd shut out directly to her door. My place, she said. It's closer. I have supplies there. We can get you patched up and be on our way by morning. They will be hunting me, Chayton warned. Thorn's men. Let them hunt. She offered him her hand. Right now they're hunting in a storm. That gives us a head start. He took her hand. His grip was surprisingly strong, a current of resilient life passing between them. As she pulled him to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder and taking on most of his weight, a distant sound made her blood freeze. It was faint, nearly lost in the deluge, but unmistakable, the panicked whinny of a horse. They're closer than we thought, she whispered, her heart pounding against her ribs. They had to move, and they had to move now. The journey to her shelter was a brutal stumbling ordeal. Every step was a battle against the sucking mud, the driving rain, and Chaitin's failing strength. Clara's small frame strained under his weight, but she pushed onward, her jaw set with grim determination. Her stone dwelling was built into a natural depression, its low profile almost invisible against the dark, rain-slicked hillside. As they neared the heavy wooden door, Chaitin suddenly stiffened. "Listen," he breathed. Clara froze, straining her ears against the storm. Through the howl of the wind, she caught at voices carried on the air. "Tracks wash out in this mess. Can't have gotten far with those wounds. Thorn wants him alive, and whatever he's carrying, they knew." They weren't just hunting him. They were hunting for the proof her father had gathered. She practically threw Chaitin through the doorway and slammed the heavy iron-banded door shut, sliding the thick wooden bar into place. The sudden silence inside was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing and the drumming of rain on the roof. The single room was Spartan but orderly. A stone fireplace, a small bed shelves stocked with preserved food and medical herbs. It was her sanctuary, her fortress, and she had just led the enemy to its gates. On the bed, she ordered helping Chaitin across the room. He collapsed onto the cot, his face ashen. As she lit a lantern, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room, a shadow passed the small shuttered window. One of the riders was right outside. Clara held her breath, every muscle tensed. She could hear the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of a bridle. A voice rough and angry cut through the storm. "Nothing here but an old hermit's shack. Let's check the caves east of here." No, another voice answered closer this time. It was smooth, controlled, and utterly chilling. It was Silas Thorn. "My sources were clear. This is the place. A recluse. A woman. Matches the description of Thomas Bell's daughter." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. He knew about her. He had been looking for her. "Check it," Thorn commanded. A heavy boot thumped against the door. Barred from the inside, the first voice yelled back, "Then take it down." Thorn replied, his voice calm, patient, and utterly terrifying. Clara scrambled, her mind racing. She grabbed her father's rifle from its pegs on the wall, her hands shaking as she checked the load. Chaitin, seeing the look on her face, began struggling to sit up. "Clara," he whispered, his hand going to the pouch with the watch. "If they get in—" "They won't," she said, her voice a low growl. She moved to the fireplace, her eyes scanning the simple room, looking for an advantage in escape. There was none. The door was the only way in or out. The first heavy blow struck the door, making the entire structure shudder. Wood splintered, then another and another. They were using a log as a battering ram. She looked at Chaitin, his face pale in the lantern light. His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw not fear, but a grim resolve that mirrored her own. In that silent, desperate moment, an unspoken pact was sealed. They would not be taken alive. The truth her father had died and lived to protect would not die with them in this small stone room. She raised the rifle, braced it against her shoulder, and aimed it squarely at the groaning, splintering wood of the door. The battle for redemption had come to her. The heavy log slammed against the door again, and the crossbar groaned, spitting splinters into the room. A crack appeared, widening with each rhythmic, brutal impact. Thorn was patient, letting his men do the work, his chillingly calm voice occasionally drifting through the storm. "Put your backs into it. There's nowhere for them to run." "There's a root cellar," Clara whispered, her eyes darting to a heavy trap door in the floorboards near the hearth. "It's small. Connects to an old mining tunnel. It's a long shot. It might have collapsed. Better than no shot at all." Chaitin grunted, pushing himself off the bed. He swayed, his face slick with a mixture of sweat and rainwater, but his eyes were clear. He pulled a long knife from his boot, the only weapon he had left. "You go. Take the watch. I'll hold them here. No, Clara said, her voice diamond hard. I told you, we're in this together. Another shuddering crash. The top hinge of the door tore loose from the frame with a shriek of tortured metal. It wouldn't hold for more than another minute. The fireplace, she said, an idea sparking in the panic. The flue is wide. My father built it so he could climb up to clean it. She pointed upward with the rifle barrel. It opens out on the ridge behind the house. They won't be looking for us up there. It was a desperate, insane plan. The chimney was narrow, slick with creosote, and Chaitan was badly wounded. But it was their only chance. Go, he urged. I'll follow. With a final shattering crack, the door burst inward, ripped from its remaining hinge. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the stormy dark. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired. The rifle's roar filled the small room, and the lead man crumpled with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 dove for cover. In that split second of chaos, Clara scrambled toward the hearth. Now she yelled to Chaitan. He was already moving, dragging his wounded leg. As Clara boosted herself into the dark opening of the fireplace, she saw him turn to face the door, his knife held ready. He was buying her time. A pistol fired the bullets, smacking into the stone beside her head, showering her with chips. She clawed her way up the rough-hewn stone of the flue, her boots finding purchase her fingers raw. Above, she could see a faint circle of gray, stormy light. She risked a glance down. Chaitan was a shadow engaged in a deadly dance with another shadow. A blade flashed. A man grunted in pain. Then Silas Thorne stepped into the room. He didn't rush. He moved with the unhurried grace of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. He held a pistol, but he didn't fire. He simply watched the fight, a faint, curious smile on his lips. Impressive, Thorne's voice echoed up the chimney. But this ends now. Clara heard a sickening thud, and Chaitan cried out. She had to keep moving. She couldn't look back. She pushed upward, her lungs burning, and finally her hands found the cold, wet stone of the chimney's edge. She hauled herself out onto the rocky ridge behind her home just as the storm reached its crescendo. The wind howled, threatening to tear her from her perch. Below, another gunshot echoed from within her home. A terrible final silence followed. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara thought Chaitan was dead. Her grief and rage were a physical blow, nearly sending her to her knees. But then a hand grabbed her ankle. She looked down to see Chaitan emerging from the chimney, his face a mask of pain, a fresh, dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He'd been shot. He's alive, she choked out. The one I stabbed will trouble no one again. Chaitan gasped, pulling himself onto the ledge beside her. Thorne. He wants us alive. They scrambled away from the chimney opening, huddling behind a rocky outcrop as the wind whipped around them. They were exposed, wounded, with Thorne and his men just feet below. He knows about the tunnel, Clara realized with a fresh wave of horror. That's why he was so calm. He's hurting us. As if on cue, a lantern glow appeared at the base of the ridge some 50 yards to their left. The exit of the mining tunnel. Thorne had cut off their only other escape route. They were trapped on the ridge with a sheer drop on one side and Thorne's men closing in on the others. The proof is gone. Chaitan said, his voice ragged. He held up his hands. His tunic was torn and the hidden pouch where he had kept the watch was gone. Thorne has it. He has your father's watch. Clara stared at him, the rain plastering his dark hair to his skull. The watch was gone. The only proof they had was in the hands of their enemy. For a moment, despair washed over her, cold and absolute. They had lost. But then she looked at Chaitan. He was bleeding from 3 separate wounds, exhausted, but he was still fighting. He had faced down Thorne's men to give her a chance to escape. He had followed her up a chimney when he could barely stand. He hadn't given up. She wouldn't either. No, she said, her voice rising above the wind. He has the watch. He doesn't have the witness. She tapped her own temple. My father told you where to find me. He trusted me. And you told me everything he discovered. It's all in here. Thorn doesn't know that. A new light entered Chaitin's eyes. He understood. They were the evidence now. Their testimony delivered to the right people could still expose Thorn. The council meeting at the Canyon of Whispering Winds, he said. We can still make it. It's over a day's ride and we have no horses. Clara pointed out the grim reality of their situation setting in. Then we walk, Chaitin said simply. Below them, Thorn's voice cut through the gale. Clara Bell, I know you're up there. I have something that belongs to you. There was a pause. Your father was a foolish man. He put his faith in a broken system. Don't make the same mistake. Come down and I'll let your warrior friend live. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Clara peered over the rock. Thorn stood in the doorway of her ruined home, holding the silver pocket watch up to the lantern light, letting it glint. He was smiling that same cold, confident smile. Clara met Chaitin's gaze. There was no need for words. They had one chance, and it was as thin as a razor's edge. She pointed east toward the sheerest part of the cliff face. There's a game trail down there. It's treacherous, especially in this storm. But they won't expect us to go that way. They will expect us to die. Chaitin corrected, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then let's disappoint them, Clara said. And together they turned their backs on the hunter and plunged into the storm-lashed darkness. Dawn broke over a bruised and battered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cold. For Clara and Chaitin, there had been no rest. They had stumbled and slid their way down the treacherous game trail, their descent a nightmare of loose rock and slick mud. Every step was agony for Chaitin, but he never complained, his silence a testament to his incredible endurance. They found shelter in a shallow cave as the first light touched the sky, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion. Clara tore strips from her petticoat to create fresh bandages, her movements efficient despite her trembling hands. She cleaned his wounds as best she could with water from her canteen, her mother's lessons echoing in her mind. The bullet in his shoulder had passed clean through a small miracle, but he'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. We need to find your father, she said, her voice low. If Thorn knows where I live, he might know where my father is hiding. He could be in danger. The Broken Spur Ranch. Chaitin said, his voice weak. 50 miles north. He works there under the name of Thomas Cole. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a heavy sadness. Clara, Thorn isn't just a land grabber. What he's doing, it's personal. Your father told me. They were partners once. Clara stopped wrapping the bandage, her hands frozen. Partners in what? A mining venture. Years ago, right after they first settled here. They bought a claim together not far from here. They poured everything they had into it. The story spilled out of him, a torrent of revelation that reshaped Clara's entire understanding of her past. Thomas Bell and Silas Thorn had been friends, two ambitious young men seeking to build a future in the West. Thomas was the geologist, the man who understood the land. Silas was the businessman, the one with connections and capital. Their venture was promising, but they were short on funds. Thomas had urged caution, wanting to secure their claim legally before expanding. Silas, impatient and hungry for success, had pushed to start mining immediately, cutting corners and moving onto land whose ownership was disputed with the local tribe. That was the beginning of the end. Chaitin murmured, his eyes distant. Silas brought his wife and young son to the mining camp. He wanted to show them the empire he was building. Thomas warned him it wasn't safe. The tensions with the tribe over the land were growing. He begged Silas to take his family back to redemption. A knot of dread tightened in Clara's stomach. She knew what was coming next. Silas refused. He accused your father of being timid, of wanting to keep all the glory for himself. They had a terrible fight. Your father rode to the territorial office to file the claim properly to try and fix the mess Silas had made. While he was gone, Chayton's voice trailed off. "The raid," Clara whispered. He nodded grimly. A small radical faction of warriors acting against the council's wishes attacked the camp. They saw it as an encroachment on sacred ground. Silas's wife and son were killed. The horror of it settled over Clara, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't about greed. It was about grief. A grief that had festered into a monstrous, all-consuming need for revenge. When your father returned, the camp was destroyed. Silas was half-mad with sorrow. He blamed the tribe, but most of all, he blamed Thomas. He screamed that if Thomas had been there, if he hadn't been so worried about his precious paperwork, he could have helped defend the camp. He accused your father of cowardice, of murdering his family. Now she understood the cold contempt in Thorne's eyes. He looked at the world and saw only a reflection of his own loss. The partnership dissolved. Chayton continued. Your father, racked with guilt, tried to make peace, but Silas was lost to his hatred. He vanished for years, and when he returned, he had money and power. He had become Silas Thorne, the man who would burn the whole territory to the ground to avenge a memory. He believes your father took his family from him, so he staged the raid on your family's wagon to return the favor. The revelation was a physical blow. Her family hadn't been a random casualty. They had been a message. Thorne hadn't just wanted her father dead. He wanted him to suffer, to feel the same agonizing loss that had twisted him into a monster. My father's guilt. Clara murmured, thinking of his isolation, his decision to hide rather than fight. He wasn't hiding from Thorne. He was hiding from himself. He was trying to make it right, Chayton corrected gently. He spent years uncovering Thorne's network, his conspiracy. He couldn't bring back Silas's family, but he believed he could stop him from creating more widows and orphans. Getting that proof to the Peace Council was his way of atoning. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Clara's personal quest for a stolen locket had become intertwined with a tragedy that stretched back decades. This was no longer just her fight, or Chayton's, or her father's. It was a fight for the soul of the land itself, against a man whose heart had been broken and filled with poison. We have to get to my father. Clara said, her voice filled with a new urgent resolve. Before Thorne does. She looked at Chayton's wounds, at their lack of food, water, or horses. And then we go to that canyon. With or without the evidence, we will be heard. As they prepared to set out on the long march north, Clara noticed something that made her pause. On the outskirts of Redemption, far in the distance, a lone rider was kicking up a trail of dust, heading not toward them, but toward the Broken Spur Ranch. It was Deputy Reed, the seemingly helpful lawman from town. And he was riding far too fast for a man on a casual patrol. He's one of them, she said aloud, a sickening realization dawning on her. Deputy Reed. He's Thorne's informant. He was the one who told Thorne about me, about my homestead. And now he was riding to her father. The trap wasn't just at the canyon. It was closing in from all sides. The 50-mile trek to the Broken Spur Ranch was a grueling test of will. They moved under the cover of darkness, resting during the oppressive heat of the day, in whatever shade they could find. Clara foraged for edible roots and berries, her desert knowledge keeping them from starvation, while Chayton, despite his injuries, pushed himself relentlessly onward. A profound bond formed between them in that desperate journey, forged in shared pain and a singular purpose. They spoke little, but a deep understanding grew in the silence. She saw in him a quiet strength and an unwavering dedication to his people and his principles. He in turn saw in her a resilience that matched the harsh beauty of the land itself. They arrived at the hills overlooking the ranch on the second night. The Broken Spur was a sprawling operation nestled in a wide, fertile valley. But something was wrong. There were too many men armed and watchful patrolling the perimeter. They weren't cowboys. They moved with the disciplined alertness of hired guns. Thorne had already been here. We're too late. Clara breathed, her heart sinking. No, Chayton said, his eyes scanning the layout of the ranch. Look there. He pointed to the main ranch house. A single lamp burned in an upstairs window. And in the barn, a faint light flickered through the cracks in the walls. They're holding him here. If they wanted him dead, they would have done it already. Thorne needs him for something. The meeting, Clara realized. He's going to use my father to control the settler delegation, to force them into his trap. They watched for hours, studying the guards' patterns, mapping out the ranch in their minds. A plan began to form, desperate and fraught with danger. They couldn't fight their way in. They had to be smarter. The foreman of this ranch, a man named Jedediah. He's loyal to your father, Chayton said, relaying information Thomas Bell had shared with him. If we can get a message to him, he might be able to help. Using the cover of a moonless night, Clara crept down toward the ranch. She moved like a phantom, a skill honed by years of solitude. She reached a small bunkhouse set away from the main buildings. A single grizzled cowboy sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood, a shotgun resting across his lap. This had to be Jedediah. Clara mimicked the call of a screech owl, a signal she and her father had used when they were children. The old man's head snapped up. His eyes peered into the darkness. She did it again. Slowly, the man put down his whittling, picked up his shotgun, and ambled off the porch, heading toward the sound, as if investigating a disturbance. When he was far enough from the bunkhouse, Clara emerged from the shadows. Jedediah. The man spun around, leveling the shotgun. His weathered face was a mask of suspicion. Who's asking? Thomas Bell's daughter. The man's eyes widened. He lowered the gun. Clara, my God, girl. We all thought you were dead. My father, she said urgently. Is he? He's alive. Thorne's got him locked in the barn. He and that snake of a Deputy Reed. They're planning on taking him to the canyon tomorrow morning. He spat on the ground. Thorne's men are everywhere. I'm the only one left here who ain't on his payroll. We need to get him out, Clara said. Jedediah shook his head grimly. Impossible. They've got 2 guards on the barn at all times. Then we don't get him out. Chayton said, emerging silently from the darkness behind Clara. Jedediah jumped, raising his shotgun again before recognizing the warrior from Thomas's descriptions. We create a diversion. Something big enough to pull every man here out of position. The plan was simple, reckless, and their only option. At the far end of the valley was a large, dry pasture where the ranch's main herd of cattle was penned for the night. A stampede. An hour before dawn, as the guards were at their drowsiest, Jedediah crept to the bunkhouse and set a small, controlled fire in a haystack. As the flames leapt into the sky, shouts of alarm echoed across the ranch. Men poured out of the buildings, their attention focused on the blaze. At the same moment, Clara and Chayton, who had circled around to the pasture, cut the ropes on the cattle pen. With a series of whoops and cries, they sent the terrified herd thundering directly through the heart of the ranch. The ground shook. The chaos was absolute. Hired guns who were supposed to be guarding a prisoner were suddenly scrambling for their lives, trying to escape the river of horns and hooves. In the confusion, they raced to the barn. The 2 guards, distracted by the stampede, were easy to overpower. Chayton dispatched one with silent efficiency, while Clara brought the butt of her rifle down on the head of the other. She slid the heavy bar from the barn door and threw it open. In the dim light, she saw him. Her father. He was older, thinner, his face etched with lines of grief and guilt, but it was him. He was chained to a support beam. Clara. Thomas Bell whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and emotion. He looked from her face to Chayton, who stood watch at the door. You found him. You're alive. There was no time for a tearful reunion. Clara found a sledgehammer and with a few powerful swings shattered the chain holding her father. Thorne's plan. Thomas said, his voice regaining its strength. He was going to have me plead with the settler council to lay down their arms for a peaceful negotiation, leading them right into an ambush. He has men hidden in the rocks all around the canyon. He looked at Chayton. And he plans to have you presented as the captured leader of the renegade natives, forcing your people to negotiate from a position of weakness. Then we have to warn them, Chayton said. There's no time, Thomas countered. The meeting is at sunrise. They're already on their way. Our only chance is to get there and expose him in front of both sides. As they slipped out of the barn, they saw Silas Thorne and Deputy Reed on the porch of the main house, their faces illuminated by the fire, their expressions furious as they tried to make sense of the chaos. Thorne's eyes swept across the scene, and for a moment they seemed to lock directly onto the barn. He knew. Go, Thomas yelled, shoving Clara and Chayton toward a small copse of trees where Jedediah had tethered 3 horses. Get to the canyon, I'll slow them down. No, I'm not leaving you again, Clara cried, grabbing his arm. You have to, he said, his eyes pleading. For your mother, for your brother, for everyone Thorne will destroy if he isn't stopped. This is our only chance to make it right. Now go. He kissed her forehead, a lifetime of love and regret in the simple gesture, then turned and ran back into the chaos, firing a pistol into the air to draw attention away from them. With tears streaming down her face, Clara mounted one of the horses. She, Chayton, and Jedediah spurred their mounts, riding hard for the canyon of whispering winds, the sounds of shouting and gunfire from the ranch fading behind them. They were riding into the heart of the trap, and their only weapons the truth and the desperate hope that it would be enough. They rode like the devil was on their heels, the rising sun at their backs. The entrance to the canyon of whispering winds was a narrow slash in the red rock, and as they neared, they saw them 2 separate delegations approaching from opposite directions, converging on a natural amphitheater in the canyon's heart. From the east came the settlers, a dozen men led by Sheriff Miller, and a stern-faced man Clara assumed was Samuel Crawford. From the west, a party of tribal elders, led by a tall, dignified warrior with graying hair running bare. A knot of dread formed in Clara's gut. The trap was set. They were walking right into it. At that same moment, the wind began to shift. The air grew heavy static. On the horizon, a colossal wall of roiling brown dust was rising, a desert storm of terrifying proportions. It was a ticking clock, promising either cover or a tomb. They galloped into the canyon, Jedediah, splitting off to circle around the rim, promising to see what I can do from higher ground. Clara and Chayton rode directly toward the center of the amphitheater, placing themselves between the 2 approaching groups. Sheriff Miller running bare. It's a trap, Clara shouted, her voice hoarse. Both parties halted, hands moving to their weapons, confusion and suspicion on their faces. Clara Bell's Sheriff Miller called out, his eyes wide with astonishment. What in blazes is going on? Before she could explain, another group of riders appeared at the canyon entrance. It was Silas Thorne with Deputy Reed and a dozen of his men. And they had her father. Thomas Bell was slumped over his saddlebound and gagged. Thorne rode forward, a theatrical smile on his face. He stopped beside Clara, his presence radiating a chilling authority. A family reunion. How touching. He gestured to the delegations. Gentlemen, please, there's no need for alarm. We are all here for peace, are we not? Deputy Reed dismounted, walking calmly toward Sheriff Miller's group. Sheriff, he said, his voice full of false sincerity. Thorne has evidence that this warrior, he pointed at Chayton, has been leading raids on our families. He's brought him here to face justice. Several of the settlers nodded, their faces hardening as they looked at Chayton. Simultaneously, Thorne addressed Running Bear. And for you, esteemed elder, I have brought the man responsible for encroaching on your lands and stirring up trouble. He gestured to the bound Thomas Bell. Once justice is served, our two great peoples can finally live in peace. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, playing to each side's deepest fears and prejudices. He was presenting them with perfect scapegoats. Clara could see the indecision on their faces, the temptation to accept this simple, bloody solution. Then the first gust of the storm hit her, whipping sand and dust through the canyon, making everyone squint. The sky turned a sickly yellow. The temperature dropped. Thorne's smile tightened. His time was running out. He pulled his pistol and leveled it at Thomas Bell's head. However, he said, his voice rising over the wind's howl, "There has been a complication." His cold eyes found Clara. It seems the daughter has inherited the father's sentimentality. She and the warrior here possess certain documents, lies and fabrications designed to slander my good name. He nudged her father with the barrel of the gun. So, Clara, you have a choice. A simple one. In the center of this clearing, you will build a fire. You will burn every last page of your father's evidence. You will do it where everyone can see. In exchange, I will give you his life. The wind howled, obscuring his next words from the delegations, but carrying them clearly to Clara. Refuse, and he dies right here. My men are hidden in the rocks above. They will open fire on everyone. I will ride away in the confusion, and this valley will be consecrated with the blood of both your peoples. A tragedy, to be sure, but one that will leave the land empty. It was the ultimate cruel dilemma. Her personal love versus the fate of two nations. Save her father, and let the villain walk free, allowing the seeds of hatred he'd sown to blossom into a devastating war. Or sacrifice him for the greater good, a choice she wasn't sure she could live with. The dust swirled around them, the world narrowing to the man she loved, the man she was beginning to love, and the monster who held all their lives in his hand. The dust storm was a living thing, a screaming, scouring beast that clawed at the canyon. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The world became a maelstrom of sand and sound. In the heart of it, Clara faced Silas Thorne, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. Her father's life hung in the balance. Thorne's pistol remained steady against his temple. She looked at her father. Through the gag, his eyes pleaded with her. Not for his own life, she realized, but for her to be strong, to make the right choice, the hard choice. She looked at Chayton, who stood beside her horse, his hand resting near the hilt of his knife, his face a mask of tense readiness. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He would follow her lead. Clara took a deep breath, the grit stinging her lungs. She couldn't choose one over the other. She had to choose a third path. All right, she called out, her voice straining to be heard over the gale. You win, Thorne. I'll burn it. A flicker of triumph crossed Thorne's face. He gestured with his pistol. Wise girl. Build the fire. Now. Clara dismounted slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the center of the clearing, her back to Thorne, and knelt as if to gather kindling. But her hands went to her boots. Tucked inside each one was a small, razor-sharp skinning knife. She palmed them, keeping them hidden. She rose and turned, taking a step toward Chayton's horse, where the satchel with her father's ledgers was tied. I need the papers, she said, her eyes locking with Chayton's, trying to convey a message with a single look. Get ready. Give them to her, Thorne ordered. As Chayton untied the satchel, Clara took another step, putting herself between Thorne and the two delegations, who were now just indistinct shapes in the swirling dust. Before I do this, she shouted, her voice carrying to them, I want everyone to know the truth. Silas Thorne was my father's partner. His family died in a raid on land they stole from the tribe. This was never about justice. It's about revenge. Silence her, Thorne roared, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been planted. At that exact moment, a rifle shot cracked from the canyon rim above. One of Thorne's hidden riflemen cried out and tumbled from his perch. Jedediah. He'd found his spot. The shot was the signal. Chayton threw the satchel not at Clara, but high into the air, toward Sheriff Miller. Simultaneously, Clara lunged not toward the fire, but sideways, throwing both knives with a single fluid motion. One hurtled toward Thorne. The other spun through the air toward Deputy Reed. Thorne, startled by the gunshot, and the flying satchel instinctively jerked back. The knife missed its mark, slicing through the reins of his horse instead. The panicked animal reared, screaming, throwing Thorne from the saddle. His shot went wild, harmlessly into the sky. Deputy Reed was not so lucky. Clara's second knife buried itself in his shoulder, and he went down with a howl of pain. All hell broke loose. Thorne's men, their positions revealed by Jedediah's shot, opened fire. The settlers and warriors, finally understanding the depth of the betrayal, dove for cover and began firing back. The canyon became a blind, chaotic battlefield, the swirling dust punctuated by muzzle flashes. Clara scrambled toward her father, who had been thrown to the ground when Thorne's horse reared. She cut his bonds as Chayton engaged two of Thorne's men, his knife a blur in the gloom. He fought with a fierce, desperate grace, protecting the flank of the tribal elders. Clara got her father to his feet. "Get to the caves," she screamed, pointing toward the dark mouths in the canyon wall. She grabbed Thorne's dropped pistol from the sand. The battle raged, a confused, close-quarters affair. Loyalties ceased to matter. It was no longer settler against warrior. It was the deceived against the deceivers. Men who had arrived as enemies now found themselves fighting back-to-back, covering each other as they retreated toward the shelter of the caves. Through a momentary thinning of the dust, Clara saw Thorne. He had recovered his footing, his face a mask of pure fury. His charisma was gone, stripped away, to reveal the raw, grieving monster beneath. He saw her, and his eyes burned with a hatred that was terrifyingly personal. He ignored the battle around him and charged toward her, drawing a Bowie knife. This was it. The final confrontation. Not for land, not for silver, but for the memory of two families destroyed by the same tragedy. He lunged. She fired. The bullet grazed his arm, but he barely flinched, his momentum carrying him forward. He slammed into her, and they went down rolling in the thick dust. He was stronger, fueled by years of rage. His knife hand rose ready to strike. But Clara was a survivor. She fought with the ferocity of the desert itself. She jammed the barrel of the empty pistol into his face, buying a precious second. Her hand scrabbled in the sand, closing around a heavy, smooth rock. She brought it down on the side of his head with all her strength. He grunted his eyes, losing focus for just an instant. It was all she needed. She rolled out from under him, scrambling to her feet, panting and bloody. Silas Thorne lay stunned in the dust, the great storm he had unleashed, raging around him, a fitting tempest for a man whose soul had known no peace. The dust storm abated as quickly as it had arrived. As the last of the brown haze settled, it revealed a transformed landscape. The canyon was eerily quiet, the silence broken by the groans of the wounded. In the chaos, the battle had ended, not with a victory, but with a shared, desperate survival. Settlers and warriors emerged from the caves where they had taken shelter together. The lines of division had been blurred, washed away by the storm and the shared fight against a common enemy. A settler offered his canteen to a wounded warrior. An elder from the tribe helped Sheriff Miller splint another man's broken arm. In the crucible of the canyon, forced together by the fury of nature and the treachery of man, a new understanding was being born. Silas Thorne and his surviving men, including the wounded Deputy Reed, were rounded up. A joint party of Sheriff Miller's men and Chayton's warriors bound them tightly. The satchel of evidence had been recovered, its contents now irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. Clara found her father tending to Chayton's wounds near the mouth of a cave. The bullet graze on his shoulder was minor, but he was weak from his long ordeal. The three of them stood together, watching the new fragile peace take hold. "He deserved to die," Thomas Bell said quietly, his gaze fixed on the captive Thorne. "No," Clara replied, her voice steady. "He deserves to live." He needs to see what he tried to destroy and watch it heal. He needs to see a future he has no part in. That's a punishment worse than death for a man like him. Running Bear and Samuel Crawford approached them, their faces grim but resolute. "We owe you a great debt." Running Bear said, his eyes resting on Clara and Chayton with profound respect. "You saved us from our own blindness. We'll see that Thorne and every man connected to him faces justice," Crawford added. "A joint tribunal, our laws and yours working together." It was the beginning, a small uncertain step on a long road. But it was a beginning. Days later, they stood on the small windswept hill where Clara had buried what she thought was her family. 3 simple wooden crosses stood against the vast expanse of the sky. The air was clean, the land quiet and healing. Clara stepped forward. In her hand she held the silver locket. Jedediah had found it on Thorne along with her father's pocket watch. She had cleaned the tarnish away, and the silver shone brightly in the afternoon sun. She didn't open it. She knew the faces inside. They were etched permanently in her memory. With a quiet reverence, she hung the locket over the central cross, the one that marked her mother's grave. It glinted in the sunlight, a small beacon of memory, no longer a weight chaining her to the past, but a gentle anchor of love. It was an act of letting go of peace. Her father stepped up beside her. He held his own reclaimed memento, the silver pocket watch. He looked at it for a long moment, the symbol of a legacy he once thought had ended in ashes. Then he turned to Chayton, who stood respectfully a few feet away. Thomas Bell took Chayton's hand and pressed the watch firmly into his palm. "Time heals all wounds," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a gift of payment or gratitude. It was a gesture of profound acceptance, a passing of the mantle. It was a father entrusting the future to the man who had helped save it, the man who stood beside his daughter, not as a warrior of another nation, but as family. Chayton closed his fingers around the watch, its weight solid and real. He looked at Clara, and his eyes held a promise of a future built not on separate traditions, but on shared ground. They stood there for a long time, the 3 of them, a new family forged in tragedy and truth. They looked out at the vast, open land, no longer a place of isolated grief or disputed borders, but a home, ready for a new story to be written upon it.